Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amy Tureen. I'm going to go ahead and get started if that works with you, Leslie.
Sure, Amy. Let me give you a quick introduction.
Sure thing.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for a presentation today by Amy Tureen. The title is Rocks Roll Downhill, the role of supervisor in creating and maintaining healthy and humane workplace. Amy joins us from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She is the head of the Library Liaison Program there. She holds a BA from Scripps College and an MA from Simmons University and an MLIS from Drexel University. She is currently working on her EDD in organizational leadership at the University of Laverne. Amy's research primarily focuses on the various intersections of leadership, wellness, and diversity. Please give her your attention and thanks again for joining us.
All right, everybody. Hi there. As mentioned, my name is Amy Tureen. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I encourage you to interact with one another in the chat throughout my presentation, but please understand that I will not be able to view the chat while presenting. To help ensure that I will not end up distracting myself, I'm going to conduct the majority of my presentation with my camera off. I will, however, turn it back on for the Q&A portion of the session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. I myself am presenting from the traditional and unceded territory of the Nuwu people, also known as the Southern Paiute people, and I am a settler on land that has historically been used and stewarded by both past ancestors and current members of the Las Vegas Paiute tribe. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge both the historical and contemporary harms caused by white supremacy that have led and continue to lead to the enforced relocation, murder, impoverishment, and theft of language, culture, and traditions of so many indigenous people around the world. I encourage everyone to consider taking action, such as making a donation to a land recovery effort. I have included the names and websites of 3 land recovery organizations for your consideration. These include the LandBack Project, the Indian, spelled NDN Collective, which is the sponsor of the official LandBack Project, and the Indian Land Tenure Fund. Thank you. Before I dive into the meat of my presentation, I want to take a few minutes and talk about what led to me thinking about and researching in these areas. In 2012, I moved from my home state of California to the state of Georgia, hence all the peaches in the photo. I made this move to start my first library faculty position at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. At the time of my move, I had only been to Georgia and honestly the entire South for an interview a few months before. I had moved about, I would guess, 3 days before starting my job, and I was still adapting to being ma'amed and having phone conversations end with God bless, although I will note they never ended with bless your heart. That is an entirely separate meaning. At my first one-on-one with my new boss, the excellent and incomparable Theresa Rhodes, I was given a piece of amazing advice, except honestly, because it was my first day and my first job, and I was really still adapting to the time and the culture and all the things that come with moving, I entirely missed it. Theresa had started the meeting by sharing her onboarding materials. This was a mid-sized binder filled with all kinds of documentation, policies, standardized forms, contact lists, job duty expectations, the things you would expect. The folder also included a document about Theresa herself, and it told me the names of her husband and her cats, her preferred working hours, and her out-of-work email policy. This document would prove useful and important in the future, but at the moment, I was new and bewildered and pretty sure that I was now a professional woman, all caps. And so I didn't register the importance of the document at that time. Anyways, at the end of the meeting, after we'd gone through the binder in detail, Theresa did something remarkable. Although, again, remember, I didn't know it was remarkable at the time. My new boss looked me dead in the eye and said, I want you to promise me 3 things. Okay, I said. I mean, this was my new boss. Whatever she wanted, I was probably going to do. I want you to promise me that you will find friends who don't work in the library and don't work at Mercer. Okay, I said. I thought this was strange, but whatever. Making friends seemed easy enough, although placing limitations on where they worked seemed a bit odd. And I want you to promise me that you will make time to be physically active. Sure, I responded. Honestly, I thought this was a bit presumptuous, but Theresa had already told me she had already told me that she arrives very early to campus. I mean, like 4 in the morning early, and she would go to the gym at 7. Figured she was just, a sporty lady giving sporty advice. And I want you to promise me that you will find a spiritual outlet. It can be a church or a temple or just walking outside. I don't care what it is, and I will never ask you what it is, but I do want you to find something. I thought to myself, this is that whole Bible Belt thing. I've been told, mostly accurately as it turned out, that people in Macon's first question when meeting someone new was, "What's your name?" And this question was immediately followed by, "And what church do you belong to?" This would be one more story to tell my friends back home in California about life in the South. I chuckled to myself and I agreed to this last condition. And then I shook Theresa's hand. I walked out of the office, and I didn't think about those 3 promises again until 5 years later when I moved to my new supervisory position 2,000 miles away. It was only then that I realized what remarkable advice Theresa had offered me on that day. What I had mistaken as hokey down-home wisdom was really an incredible gift. I was being told by my boss on my first day, as a part of a discussion regarding expectations for my tenure as an employee, that part of working for Theresa meant not only doing my job, but also caring for myself, socially, physically, and spiritually. I was being invited. No, I was actually being instructed to care for my whole self. This was remarkable advice to receive, both in terms of what these promises said about Theresa's values and expectations, as well as just generally solid advice. It's hard to function well when you don't care for the many aspects of yourself. Poor treatment of oneself causes harm to oneself, and if you happen to be responsible for other people, it can cause knock-on harm to even more folks. Leadership is always something of a cascade scenario. What leaders enforce, enable, and model will, generally speaking, filter down and replicate. It is up to leaders to be mindful about what kind of cascade they are generating, ones that promote wellness or ones that cause ongoing patterns of harm. So let's talk about why workplace wellness matters. This section is of importance to everyone, no matter what their role is in libraries. A note here, my statistics on this section reflect the American work experience and survey results, but the themes are nonetheless applicable to workers outside the United States context as well. Stress has both physiological and psychological side effects. These effects are both short-term and long-term. Short-term psychological effects can include anxiety, narrowing of focus, inability to focus, the activation of the flight or fight response. Similarly, stress has a number of short-term physical effects as well. These can include headaches, shaking or other expressions of nervous energy, upset stomach, and sleep disorders. And when stress continues over very long periods, perhaps even reaching burnout stages, more significant physical and psychological effects can occur. Both the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic identify a whole suite of physical complaints associated with prolonged stress. This is quite a list here. It includes headache, muscle pain, chest pain, depression, anxiety, changes in sex drive, gastrointestinal distress, sleep disturbances, grinding-related tooth damage, weight loss, weight gain, hyperhidrosis, tachycardia, and others. In fact, a 2014 study from the Benson Henry Institute of Mind-Body Medicine reported that anywhere between 60 to 90% of visits to the doctor are prompted by a stress-related complaint. Effectively, we're worrying ourselves into conditions and illnesses that we might not otherwise have experienced if our health was not being challenged and degraded by ongoing stress and anxiety. Unfortunately, stress in the workplace is only getting worse. A series of surveys conducted by the American Psychological Association shows a distinct upward trend in employee stress. As you can see here, in 2013, 33% of respondents reported feeling extreme stress, while 48% responded the same pool, feeling that their overall stress levels had actually increased since 2009. Then in 2017, 61% of respondents reported feeling exhausted, while 85% of that same pool reported feeling run down and drained. In 2019, despite high levels of reported stress, a whopping 90% of respondents reported that they felt behind at work. This suggests that in addition to the negative emotional impacts generally associated with stress, at least some respondents were also beginning to experience sensations of guilt associated with a perceived lack of progress or industry. This in turn probably further exacerbated their poor mental health and emotional health conditions. And of course, then we came to 2020 and the emergence of the novel coronavirus. The psychological impact of both coronavirus and the steps made necessary to reduce its spread may have led to even sharper rises in overall stress. The stress has many manifestations and causes, including ongoing uncertainty, fear of exposure, and side effects from extended isolation, among others. Library workers have experienced a vast variety of workplace responses to COVID, with some required by their employees to return to work in at-risk exposure. Others remain working from home for more than a year and face increasing lack of division between their work life and their personal life, because we are still in the pandemic. And I really want to emphasize that. We are still in the pandemic. We do not yet know what the ultimate psychological, physiological, and emotional toll of COVID-19 will be. Given the emerging studies, however, it's going to be pretty significant. So why, some may ask, should organizations and employers care about workplace wellness? Well, honestly, my gut response is that they should care because it's a decent and moral thing to do. But for those who need reasons that are more compelling to the capitalist cause, there is this simple fact. High or ongoing stress leads to illness. Illness leads to a decrease in efficiency, potential absenteeism, and higher than normal turnover. It is more efficient for organizations to care about their employees and to provide preventative health measures than to try and cope with navigating ongoing absences. Consider our stacked rock here. I mean, it's beautiful, right? And it's balanced perfectly. But what happens if I remove the second rock from the bottom or the third from the top? If your workplace is struggling to see their role in supporting the wellness of workers, encourage them to see this work as part of their efforts to ensure consistency and efficiency. It may be frustrating, in fact, it will be frustrating to have to take this approach. But for organizations that are deeply entrenched in capitalist mindsets, it may be more effective than appealing to common decency. Comic book fans will know that Ben Parker, the uncle of the web-slinging superhero Spider-Man, once admonished his nephew with the oft-quoted line, "With great power comes great responsibility." Uncle Ben was right, although his wisdom applies not only to superheroes, it also applies to supervisors as well. Within organizations, there are a number of types of power structures that enable an individual's authority and control. Depending on the resource you read, the powers will number either 6, 7, or more recently 8. 7, however, has been the standard number for a while, and I think it actually reflects the types of power that are in library organizations. These commonly cited 7 powers include legitimate power. Legitimate power is the power granted by organizational position that gives an individual control over others. Essentially, it's the power granted you by virtue of your position in the org chart relative to others. You're someone's boss. Coercive power. This is the power to coerce or punish. Expert power. The power derived by both your skills and experience and the respect others have for those traits. Informational power. It's a short-term power, honestly, and it's based on ownership of information that is relevant to the current situation, and it disperses quickly once the information is shared. Power of reward. It's the opposite of coercive power. Just like it says on the tin, it allows you to reward people. Connection power. Connection power is derived from the ability to establish and maintain beneficial personal relationships. And then there's referent power. And this is the power that's granted by others to someone who they admire or acknowledge as a leader. Supervisors. By virtue of our positions in an org chart, we sit at the intersection of many of these power models. Supervisors have an obligation to use these powers carefully and in full awareness that their decisions to use certain types of powers will have both immediate and long-term effects on culture and individuals. I want to draw special attention to my claim that supervisors leveraging their power impacts organizational culture, not just individuals, particularly in the context of wellness. Even supervisors who do not intentionally engage in establishing and maintaining organizational norms in the areas of wellness will nonetheless exert impact. Employees naturally interpret culture and expectations based on the actions and reactions of administrators, leaders, and supervisors. This includes both the actions these leaders themselves take and their reactions to the choices of others. So here's some quick examples. Have you ever seen a colleague be shouted out of an office for asking for vacation time during a particularly depressing deadline? You probably remembered that later, and then you made your future requests with a little more strategy. Similarly, if an employee observes management repeatedly approving early dismissal for employees who have children so they can go see their kids in a play or do sports, that employee will probably feel more confident about assuring their child that they will be able to be an event for them before they ask. Supervisors, our actions are constantly being observed and interpreted, and we must, as a result, strive to make intentional choices that benefit the well-being of everyone. Want to do another quick story time here, a brief return to Georgia. I mentioned earlier that my old boss, Theresa, had provided a sheet of personal information in her orientation binder. There were a few other factoids on it that I did not fully appreciate when I first read them. According to Theresa's fact sheet, she elected to not have lunch in the lunchroom with everyone else so that she could instead eat alone and relax, or maybe catch a really brief nap. We were asked to please respect this lunchtime ritual unless it was an emergency, of course. Similarly, Theresa noted that she would indicate when she was having quiet time with a sign on her door. This was her time to think and focus, unless, of course, there was an emergency. At the time, my only response to these preferences was honestly that I wished that my office was big enough to have a lazy boy in it like Theresa had. But over time, I began to notice that other people, particularly people in departments overseen by Theresa, mimicked some of her habits. Most people had some iteration of quiet time signs, and one or two took comfort in knowing that it wasn't going to be a sackable offense to catch a nap during lunch instead of eating quickly and moving on immediately to the next task. In setting the norms for her own health and wellness, Theresa quietly but surely gave permission for others to do the same in order to meet their own needs. Leaders, fellow leaders, it isn't always necessary to announce new policies, to pronounce new edicts, or hold multi-day meetings to discuss norms and values when it comes to wellness. Sometimes quiet, honest, and considerate modeling does an even better job. So let's talk about what happens when you don't prioritize your own wellness. Well, that's when you start to see fallout, and rarely does that fallout exclusively impact yourself. Fallout tends to, it falls, that's why it's called that, which means it's more likely to strike those who are below you than above. There's even a name for this. It's called the seagull management paradigm. Virtually everyone has been subject to a seagull management, the seagull management paradigm at some point. And hopefully far fewer of us have actually been the cause of it. The term actually started out as a joke in the 1985 edition of Ken Blanchard's book, The 1 Minute Manager. But over time, it has become a symbol or an archetype of a specific kind of nightmare new manager. All managers, though, no matter how experienced, are at risk of having their own seagull moments. The remainder of my presentation will focus on how to avoid embracing your inner seagull and save you from having to, let's just say, clean up. Understand that moods and emotions spread. Exposure to another person's mood, particularly a strong one, can result in sympathetic mimicry. Counter this by being mindful of your emotions and their sources. Awareness of why one is feeling a particular way can help reduce the intensity of that experience. This is particularly important for my fellow low-ranking and middle managers. We have limited control over the priorities of those above us, but we also have to ensure those priorities are adopted, sometimes really quickly, by the frontline workers we oversee. Middle managers have to be vigilant then to interrupt the unnecessary spread of negative emotions from above. Imagine, for example, a middle manager who is informed by their very anxious supervisor about a sudden change in priorities. I'm sure this is something we can all identify with. That the manager's supervisor, no doubt reacting to their supervisor's anxiety, who might actually be resulting to their supervisor's anxieties, and on, is full of doom and gloom. By the end of the meeting, the middle manager, who had entered the room having no strong emotion at all, exits the room in despair. They're feeling fraught and overwhelmed. Rather than proceed directly to reporting the latest catastrophe to their employees and spreading the negative energy, managers should instead pause and be mindful. Why are you upset? Is the situation actually worthy of this level of distress? Is it possible to separate the facts from the emotion? How can this information be shared in ways that allow employees to have their own genuine organic reactions rather than prime the proverbial pump with borrowed emotions? Personally, I have a theory that all people have their own internal drama threshold. This is a highly individual level at which one can manage drama or stress before they become overwhelmed. Because these thresholds are so individualized, you may occasionally find yourself working with someone whose drama level is incompatible with yours. If you can't avoid this person, and in a work situation, let's be honest, you almost certainly can't, give yourself permission to be strategic about when you meet with them. Let's imagine, for example, that you're a brooder. Don't schedule meetings with people who force you outside your drama threshold on a Friday afternoon. Give yourself permission to refuse to have your weekend snatched away by stress and worry. If you tend to absorb other people's stress, shout out to my empaths in the crowd, bookend time around those meetings so that you can prep yourself and decompress before you have to go on to work with other folks. This will allow you to both meet your own needs and ensure your frustrations aren't being passed along to others. I also want to remind people, particularly leaders, that you're not actually responsible for fixing everything. And this is something I really struggle with in my own practice. I want to be helpful. I'm a helper, and I value my own ability to react quickly and find innovative solutions. But sometimes I run the risk of taking on problems or even just stress that isn't mine to solve or carry. Another former supervisor of mine, Pat Hawthorne, was fond of the idiom, not my monkey, not my circus. Essentially, this is a reminder to not take on problems that we're not actually responsible for. For those of us who are helpers, we need to be careful that we aren't taking on the problems of others, even just emotionally, and expending our limited energy and reserves that can be better used ensuring others don't suffer from our own inevitable fallout. And of course, the workplace isn't the only place where one's personal rocks may fall. Returning home exhausted, only to careen directly into the needs and demands of others can result in similar and just as damaging rock slides as well. If you find yourself unloading the moment you arrive home, and this approach is process is harming your relationship with someone else, it might be time to reconsider how you separate your work life from your home life. For myself, I need a bit of time after work to decompress. Honestly, it's usually about 30 minutes to an hour. Other folks I know set a timer that limits how long they can talk about work with their partners, their children, even their pets. I mean, the things that my cat has heard, people, it's amazing. Others swear by stress-producing effects of exercise, crafting, zoning out in front of the TV, or just really losing themselves in an engaging book when they first get home. Whatever your process, make sure you have a plan in place and ensure you are able to engage in it regularly, if not daily, to help keep those work rocks at work and not in your home. It would be remiss of me to not note at this point that the line between work and home has become increasingly porous, particularly since the outbreak of coronavirus. For example, I spent 18 months in my office, which prior to March 2020 had been known as the guest bedroom. Because there were no real borders between where my workplace ended and where my home began, I had to begin making imaginary borders. I only did my work projects in the office and tried whenever possible to not do anything else in the office, but to work at all, just period. even to the point that when I wanted to play World of Warcraft, I was picking up my desktop and moving it to another room. But even before the coronavirus, the borders between work and home have been permeable for years. Computers are in our homes, smartphones are in our pockets, and emails that can relay information and with them expectation anywhere in the world are available 24/7. It's therefore up to the individual employee to state, stake, and enforce their own boundaries between work and home. These approaches must necessarily be unique to the individual, their circumstances, and the requirements of their employer organization. I want to share 2 tips for how to slow rock falls that come from my mother. She's a retired K-12 educator administrator with over 40 years of experience in the working field. Like the advice of my old boss, Teresa, these were tips my mother has provided me for years, and which honestly I steadily ignored until only recently. Sorry, Mom. As I mentioned before, one of my personal challenges is to remember to not take on problems that aren't mine and to not move too fast. These are tips that are likely to be particularly used to folks who deal with similar impulses, and I suspect there's a few in the group. The first is perhaps the most important lesson I've ever, well, I can't really say that I learned it because I feel like I'm constantly relearning it. I think most of us are, probably, to be honest. And this is the life-changing magic of silence. Sometimes, honestly, many times it turns out, silence is an ideal response. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for responding to all situations with stony silence or refusing to ever give input. What I'm advocating for is to give people space to resolve their own issues without charging in and providing them with a solution that they never asked for. That they never asked for part is really key. As leaders and supervisors, we're often charged with resolving problems, which means we sometimes get on a bit of a roll and assume advice is being asked for when it isn't. And of course, advice from a boss often sounds less like advice and more like instructions. Clarifying what is needed, be that advice, empathy, or just awareness that something is occurring, is a step that will save you, and most likely your employees, quite a bit of stress and bother. And it will also help you as the supervisor retain your energy and motivation for the things that actually really matter. The second tip from my mom is for those moments when you just cannot take it anymore. Pick up a folder, you can have a few pieces of paper in it, and walk away. Across campus, to another building, even just around the block, whatever it takes, no matter what. Remember, my mother notes, no one ever questions or stops someone who is striding purposely away with a file folder in hand. It looks like you're off to an important meeting. Walking also helps you expend frustrated energy, and new scenery gives you something else to focus on other than the thing that's slowly driving you nuts. You can choose to be mindful as you walk. You can focus on the heat of the sun or the number of people walking dogs. If walking isn't an option, take your folder to an unused room and shut the door. Again, no one thinks twice about someone sitting in an empty office examining papers in a file folder. The trick here is to get away from the situation so you have space and time to reset before your rocks fall. Now, a few times in the course of this presentation, I've referenced mindfulness, and I want to quickly clarify what I personally mean by mindfulness and how I use it in the workplace to support my own well-being. My favorite definition of mindfulness comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's a prolific author and scholar in the field of both mindfulness and mind-body medicine. Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Another mindfulness devotee, Scott Eblin, deconstructs this definition as awareness is another word for noticing what's going on. Paying attention on purpose suggests that we can make the choice to be aware and notice. In the present moment means focusing on what's happening right now, not ruminating on what's already happened or worrying about what might happen. Non-judgmentally means we don't waste mental or emotional energy labeling events or thoughts as good or bad. We just acknowledge what we're seeing, thinking, and feeling. Mindfulness can help us identify and understand when our rocks are shifting. This awareness, in turn, can slow or possibly entirely stop an impending fall. There are a few things you need to know about mindfulness. Human beings are wired to react to stimuli. It's what we do. Mindfulness asks us to not simply react, but to observe our desires to react and then move forward in a more thoughtful manner. Our culture, steeped in capitalist rhetoric that encourages us to seek constant pleasure and avoid discomfort through the sedatives of gluttonous acquisition, works in direct contrast to the goals of mindfulness. This means that our commitment to mindfulness is continually challenged, both by cultural norms and cultural artifacts that encourage us to instead embrace reaction over non-judgmental awareness. This in turn makes mindfulness really hard, but that's okay. Expect it to be hard. Understand that mindfulness is a practice and practices require ongoing effort. You will never reach the point where you achieve mindfulness. And honestly, that's not even the goal. Just focus on making the practice in the moment. Much like my mother's emergency file folder plan from before, mindfulness includes a number of techniques that can be used to interrupt threatening rock falls. Most fall under the broad umbrella of meditation, and these meditations can be silent or guided. They can be focused on nothingness, on a specific sense or senses, or they can use visual imagery to shift the practitioner out of a reactive mindset and into a more mindful one. You will have to try different approaches and find what works for you. Breathing exercises can also be useful to interrupting would-be rock falls because they force the practitioner to interrupt and redirect their attention to monitoring their slow and steady inhalations. Body scan meditations can also be completed in the office, and it's another good way to slow down before the rock fall. They can be completed in silence or with an audio narration. Honestly, if you Google this, you'll find tons of them. Body scans involve focusing the attention on different parts of the body. Usually you progress from the crown of the head or rising up from the toes. It's careful, focused attention on breathing into or relaxing each individual body part, and it slows both racing hearts and minds and focuses the attention on the moment. Another common technique, and one that lends itself well to an online presentation, is the 5 senses exercise. And I'd actually like you to all join me in this exercise now. So first, and you can do this with your eyes open or closed. The first part you will need your eyes open for. Notice 5 things that you can currently see. Look around and become aware of your environment. Try to pick out something that you don't usually notice. For example, right now, some of the things I'm noticing are the golden cream grain of the wood carving on my wall. And I'm also observing the way the shadows cast patterns on my floor as the sun shines through the window and past the plants that I have on my windowsill. Second, notice 4 things that you can feel. Bring your attention to the things that you're currently feeling. It might be the texture of your clothing or the surface of the table you're resting your hands on. Is it smooth, textured, warm, or cold? Third, notice 3 things that you can hear. Listen for and notice things in the background that you might not normally notice. It could be birds chirping outside or an appliance humming in the next room. Or if you're like me, it might just be the sound of colleagues chatting down the hall. Fourth, notice 2 things that you can smell. Bring your attention to the scents that you usually filter out, either pleasant or unpleasant. Catch a whiff of the hibiscus blooming outside or food microwaving in the staff kitchen. And finally, notice 1 thing that you can taste. Take a sip of your drink, chew some gum if you have it, or simply notice the current taste in your mouth. Thank you for indulging me in slowing down and focusing for a moment. I hope this little mindfulness break helps center you. It certainly has helped me. Now, if you're interested in learning more about mindfulness, I'd also like to recommend a few additional tools. I've identified a few popular apps for mindfulness, although honestly, you'll find tons more if you look in either the App Store or the Google Play Store. The Shine app is a woman-owned app and features female-focused meditations. Liberate is Black-owned and is Black-focused the meditation app is explicitly committed to creating safe spaces for the Black community to encourage in daily meditation. Stoic is a relatively new to me app. It offers some intriguing combinations of walking meditations, puzzles, philosophy, and tools to record daily emotions and common triggers. I also want to up the amazing work of Mindfulness and Lists. If you're not familiar with this group, I suggest you do become familiar with them. They have a web page, a robust resource guide, and they also have a presence on both Twitter and Instagram. Mindfulness is only one part of self-care. If you remember back to the beginning of my lecture, I noted that my old boss had asked 3 things of me. 3 practices that would help me sustain my social, physical, and spiritual or emotional self. We all must engage in self-care for our own longevity. Supervisors must engage in self-care not only for their own selves, but for the sake of those who rely on them. And yet sometimes it can be really hard to prioritize one's own self-care. Please remember, self-care is not and never will be selfish. Self-care enables you to help yourself and others. You could even argue that self-care is a part of the social contract that allows us to live and work in community with others. You must care for yourself as well, and be gentle with yourself. Do not expect more from yourself than you would from others. You're not a superhero, and they do not give out rosettes for self-denial or overwork. Remember, too, to care for all the many aspects of yourself. All your parts need to be tended to. If needed, make use of a wellness planning worksheet. A Google search will provide you with many examples, although you can always just make your own. The one on the screen right now is available for free from the Audre Lorde Project, and the quote is from their website. Most wellness sheets identify 3 or 4 key categories: mind, body, spirit, or heart, and as you can see here, community. Find the areas that matter most to you and make weekly commitments to yourself to meet the needs in these subcategories. This is another example of a sample wellness sheet. It's also available online from Micro Designs. There is a small fee with it. What I like about this one is that it includes both the section on joy killers to avoid and the space to reflect on the past week. This kind of chart, though, honestly, could be very easily maintained in a diary, in a bullet journal. You could just do it on the Notes app on your phone. I want to thank everyone for listening so patiently with me today. I know I've been talking a lot. But before we move on to the Q&A, I want to ask each of you to do 3 things for me, for yourselves, and for Theresa Rhodes, whose advice I really should have listened to all those years ago. Promise me, and indeed promise yourselves, that going forward, you will find people to socialize with who work outside your organization, that you will make time to be physically active, and that you will find a spiritual outlet that is meaningful and fulfilling for you. Thank you.
So we'll give it just a second.
Sure
We know that
thing.
it takes some time for people to formulate questions. We'll be looking out in the chat to make you aware of any questions that come up in the chat, Amy.
Sounds good, thanks.
I wanted to let you know that Lorelai suggested taking a shower right after work, helps her relax, and then that way she doesn't unload on her husband. I thought that was an excellent suggestion.
Absolutely, that totally makes sense.
Mm-hmm. She's also asking now if you could talk more about, how to avoid mid-manager squeeze.
Well, I mean, it's going to be hard, I can tell you that. It really is mindfulness, being aware I try to give myself more time. Sometimes I tend to move very fast personally. So I have to remind myself that not everything needs to be done immediately. I also try to ask really direct questions when I am speaking with both my employees or my supervisors. And I'd be like, do you want this shared? When does it need to be shared by? What is your exact question? If I'm asking people, if I'm getting feedback from people below that I need to pass up, can you talk to me about, what's your reaction to this? What are your feelings? I do avoid saying like, you seem upset. Can you tell me why? I just that tends to come across as judgment. So instead I'll just say, what is your reaction to this? What do you think about this? If you were me, what would you do? Or how would you share this information? Just slowing it down and honestly being honest about it. When I have to share something that might be troubling to myself, I try to say, I've shared this, I'm sharing some information. It's the very beginning of it. This happened a lot during the pandemic. I have very little information. I'm sharing everything that I can. What are the specific questions you would like me to take back? And then when I brought those back, honestly, a lot of times there weren't answers. And I would come back and say, I have asked this question. If they can't give me an answer because X, Y, and Z. And the other thing too to remember is that if there's not an answer for a question for a while, keep reminding people that you're waiting for an answer. Don't wait until they ask, because if they know that you're keeping it in front of your mind, it's going to be less stressful for them.
Excellent. I wanted to also relay that Katie said that she has a lot to reflect on, and she says particularly about not inflicting her sky is falling feelings on the others. I think that's very considerate. Pamela Pfeiffer was asking if you could repeat the sentence about self-care as a part of a social contract.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just personally, I feel that self-care is a part of this. Self-care in the sense that you take care of yourself, you ensure that you're not passing harm on to others. It's part of our social contract. You can't just wander into work and not be thoughtful in the way that you engage with other people, because the way you act, the way the energy you impart, it goes on to other people, and it might go on to multiple people, on and on and on. So you come in and freak out at someone, they go home, they freak out at their husband. Now both the couple are upset. They start freaking out at their children. The kid's upset. Now they freak out at the dog. We have a social contract to be kind to ourselves and to others so that they can remain in a space where they are able to be kind to themselves and others.
Excellent. We have another question from Maya. She wants to know if there is a general way to suggest wellness practices to a supervisor.
Maya, are you particularly interested in suggesting that they need to engage in wellness, or that you want to have space within your culture to engage in wellness? If it's the first, that can be harder because that's hard to share. The best approach I would say is, I have really been dealing with stress lately, and these are the ways that I have been doing it. How do you deal with it and deal with stress, and maybe have an exchange of ideas? If you want to incorporate wellness culture into your library or into your organization, I would start with one of those wellness sheets and say, like, this is something I'm learning about. I would like to incorporate the idea that these are domains that we value in our workplace, that we care about people's physical well-being, that we care about their emotional or spiritual or however you want to categorize it, because different organizations deal with that particular domain differently. Have those discussions. You have to be honest and help, but I do not recommend going up to someone and saying, you seem really stressed, let me fix that for you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And Melissa Cardenas Dow, she says that I'm not a supervisor, but I recognize that our departmental culture could use more humanity, compassion, and centering of wellness. What should be our first steps toward culture change?
Start by having a conversation. What is the place of work that you want? You can talk about how you're not living up to those goals right now, but honestly, that tends to become a blaming cycle, which isn't helpful. So if you kind of set values, these are the values of what and the way that these values look like, and then have some examples. And then if someone engages in a behavior that goes outside those values, a gentle kind of redirection of, is that really moving towards the culture that we want? Or is that part of our agreed upon values? But those values need to be established. It can't be, it needs to be established, written down, available, something you can refer to. Because if it's just things that every individual thinks is important on their own without any community or discussion, it's not going to work out in as successful a manner as you would like. And you could use one of the handy things, I guess, if there's going to be something handy about COVID-19, is you can have that conversation with having experienced COVID-19. I think that we need to be really clear about going forward what kind of culture we want. We have an opportunity to change the way all of society, but particularly our community, our organization, looks at work and understands what work and values and what things are important. So I'd like to start that conversation and then go into your values. And expect it'll be an iterative process. That's the other thing. This is not going to be a one meeting solution.
That's a great strategy. Amy, thanks. Natalie is asking, what can you suggest for middle managers who do have wellness practices for themselves and their staff, but administration sometimes does not value it? They just refer to EAP programs.
So I would, in that case, talk about your wellness practices with your staff, talk about why it's important to you. And you might have a meeting about, or multiple meetings about how you do how this is important. I've got a colleague over at our health sciences library, and they do an activity at the beginning of every one of their meetings called Roses and Thorns. And they talk about the best thing that's happened to them, either in their work or personally, since the last meeting, and then the worst thing. They also include an opportunity for people to bring more than just their work self. By the first, after they've done Roses and Thorns, there's a 15-minute section in all of their agendas where one of them teaches the rest of the group about something that's important to them in their own life. So they have taught things like how to do meditation. Someone taught them how to do embroidery. Someone was doing cooking lessons recently. Creating space to be about more than just work in multiple ways allows there to be discussion about how do we care for ourselves in all those ways. And the other thing is, talk to administration about just referring people to EAP isn't enough. Sometimes you need to have those conversations with administration about what you expect. And they will, I can promise you right now, don't just say EAP, referring people to EAP is not sufficient. You need to have examples of what you would like instead.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent recommendation. I always tell staff, if you really want to help with bring about change, or get us closer to resolution or to a solution, bring two or three recommendations to whatever issues you might have. It can really help.
It really does. I kind of compare it to, I use the example of people coming in and just throwing dead cats on my desk. They're like, oh, dead cat, fix it. And I'm like, what?
Right. No dead cats.
Yeah, no dead cats. And the other thing too is because someone throws a dead cat on your table, your first reaction is to just get it away. You're not going to be thoughtful about it. You just want to put space between you and dead cat. So do those suggestions. Yes.
That's so great. Well, it looks like chat is slowed down.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate this presentation. I'm really happy to be able to sit through it a second time. I think it's that useful.
Well, good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
I'd like to ask that everyone look out for more of our virtual forums we'll have in the coming year. I will be doing this again on different topics, but I hope that it'll be just as useful to our access services colleagues and all of our other information professional colleagues. So look out for that. Thank you all for attending. Thanks so much for your time and attention to Amy's great presentation.